Okay, so we'll get started. So I'd like to welcome you all to our session on resiliency and preparedness today. So far, I've attended all the sessions that I was able to attend up to this point. I think it's been an excellent conference, excellent symposium. So all credit to the organizers of the conference, Keith, and all your cohorts. This session here, as you all recall, 7 years ago, Long Island and the metropolitan area was hit with Superstorm Sandy, which for many of us was somewhat transformational with regard to how we view things. We look at our infrastructure, we look at how we were affected, our economy, et cetera. And what we're quick to point out to a number of people is that while people viewed Superstorm Sandy really as a worst-case situation, it was not a worst-case situation. And we'll talk about, the panel will discuss that today, but if you recall, it was actually when the winds hit Long Island, they were not even of hurricane force. Secondly, it made landfall actually in New Jersey, not on Long Island. And thirdly, it was a non-rain event. So we could think of a number of situations, a number of circumstances where we could get a storm, hurricane, or another climate change event that could actually have a more adverse impact upon our lives, our economy, and really the future of Long Island. So what we've assembled today is really a distinguished group of panelists here, and I'm going to start off with Dr. Malcolm Bowman. And Malcolm Bowman and I have a relationship. Malcolm started in addition to being a global leader on climate change and storm surge and impacts upon economies and communities based on our climate change and actually marine waters. Malcolm started a New York, New Jersey Metropolitan Storm Surge Working Group, of which I've been proud to be a member for the last, it's 3+ years now, I guess probably going on 4 years. And we have a number of professionals from the New York metropolitan area that meet essentially monthly to discuss ways in which we can hopefully address the issue of climate change, storm surge, et cetera. So our first panelist and presenter will be Dr. Malcolm Bowman. Please welcome Malcolm. I'm gonna put you on here. Oh, a second, I'll get it here. There we go. There we go. Yep, there we are. There we are. Yeah, no, back, yeah. There we go. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. What do we have, 10 minutes? Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I got involved in this storm surge business way back in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina drowned the city of New Orleans, and I wrote a story for the New York Times, which basically said New York City and Long Island were going to be next on the hit list, and nobody on the planet could say when, but it was just a matter of when and not if. So that created a kind of a stir. And so I felt like the old prophet Noah predicting the great flood. We better start building the ark. Everybody laughed at old Noah, and then it happened, and you know what happened after that. So then Sandy occurred, and as John said, we set up the Metro New York, New Jersey, and Long Island Storm Surge Working Group. It's a group of professionals. We have no official status. We're basically a think tank. We bring together a lot of experts in science, in oceanography, meteorology, urban planning, transportation, elected officials, the media, and so forth. And so we basically try and talk truth to power. The main players, of course, since Sandy in the Metro and Long Island area are the state of New York, the state of New Jersey, and New York City. The state of New York and New Jersey are participating as a partner with the Army Corps of Engineers to look at some regional solutions to some of these problems. As you know, the Army Corps has been involved in storm surge protection for many years. And talking about storm surge barriers, which is what we're promoting, if you think of New Bedford, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, and Stamford, Connecticut, those three communities all have storm barriers, and during Sandy suffered no flooding. As part of this partnership, the states of New Jersey and New York have contributed funds to the Army Corps for a study called the Harbor and Tributary Study, which is well on its way. The city of New York is also a partner, or claimed to be, but they have put $0 in, and yet they have a place at the table. I told the colonel, the head of the New York district of the Army Corps of Engineers, that Colonel Asbury, you hold the future of metropolitan New York in your hands, because decisions will be made by the Army Corps within the next 12 months that will determine whether the city and surroundings will be viable as we know it for the next 100 years. He looked at me as if I was nuts, but there is truth to that. This is the area that was flooded, the New York City area, and if we focus on Long Island, go a little further east, I'll show you in a moment, but that's pretty much what was anticipated in terms of the science. If you look at the South Shore Long Island, it's very flat. When I live in Stony Brook, and I'm fortunate to live on top of a hill in Stony Brook, and I drove down here this morning, and I said to myself, Malcolm, this is pretty flat round here. It makes me a little nervous, because if we think about climate change, rising sea levels, if the worst case happens, we're in trouble. This is why, just to finish off the New York City part of my talk, this is what we call the ring of protection, and this is the area that we can save with a couple of regional barrier systems. If you look at those, that red arrow near the Throgs Neck Bridge, and one on the bottom, or the center bottom there across the opening. Two barriers there could protect that whole region within the circle, including additional barriers at East Rockaway and Jones Inlet. But I'm going to talk a little bit about further east. This is Long Beach, and you can see that blue area is the area that was flooded during Sandy, and it was really catastrophic. A lot of the flooding came through the back bays, through the inlets behind Long Beach, and so it's not just a simple problem. This is the diagram courtesy of John, and this shows the locations where the 6 inlets in Long Island are, the biggest one being Fire Island. Some time ago, I had a visit by Assemblywoman Christine Pellegrino, whose district is pretty much where this picture is, near Fire Island, and she said, Malcolm, I want you to do some work with your team at Stony Brook to see what we might do to protect the communities of Long Island, and particularly, can we think about some sort of sea gate similar to what they have in New England that I mentioned? And she said, Malcolm, how much do you need? And I said, I don't know. We'll have to talk about it. But anyway, we have funding coming from the State Assembly through the DEC to Stony Brook, and we're starting to look at some possibilities. Now, looking at the 6 or 7 inlets is a big project, way beyond the scope of what we're doing, but so we thought we'd focus on one primarily at this stage, and that is the Fire Island Inlet. It's the largest inlet on the South Shore Long Island. A lot of water flows in there each day, and so we said, let's see if conceptually now, it would be possible to put small sea gates across the entrance to Fire Island, but remembering that in reality one would need to do all the inlets, because you can't just block the leaky hole in one place, it'll come in another. But this is the largest inlet. It's challenging because, as you probably know, it's an inlet of shifting sands. And you can see there on the picture of the lighthouse, that's where the lighthouse was built 100 years ago at the entrance, but the inlet has migrated westward about 5 miles because there is a drift of sand from east to west. But it's interesting, there's a possibility of sea gates, maybe somewhere near the Fire Island Inlet Bridge, the Robert Moses Bridge there. Why would it be, that would be an interesting spot? Well, because of the way the sand barrier beaches, it would be protected from the giant waves. During Sandy, some miles offshore, the waves are 35 feet high. And then the surges on top of that, the surges, the actual rising of the sea level due to the winds pushing the water. There's just a map. It's very complicated. So what we're doing at the moment, my students, and Matteo sitting in the front row here is one of my grad students, we're looking at starting really with what you might call the geology, the shifting sands of the inlet, which anybody who's boated through there knows that it's a continually changing challenge. So if sea gates were to be built, what might they look like? How would they be built? How would they be designed? How would you deal with all this shifting sands that might clog up the works? Just jumping across the Atlantic for a moment to the city of London. Back in 1984, they built a system of what they call the Thames River Barrier, where that red arrow is, which is just seaward of the city itself, but it's still 15 miles up the river from the ocean. That was built in response to a huge storm in 1953, drowned half the Netherlands and southeast England as well. And this is what the Thames River Barrier looks like. This is, you can see, large enough to let ships through. Basically, it's like rotating gates that normally lie flat on the bottom, but they can be tilted upwards to block the surge, which would be coming from the ocean on the right. So this is closed maybe now 10 to 12 times a year, and is very effective in protecting the ancient city of London, which is 2,000 years old, going back to Roman times. This is that's on a larger scale. This is 3 New England sea gates I mentioned. The top one is Stamford, Connecticut. And then the bottom left is a similar sort of barrier with swing gates at New Bedford, Massachusetts. And the bottom right is a different sort of design at Providence, Rhode Island. They're these sort of gates, a bit like the London ones, sort of come up, and they restrict the height of vessels they can get through. It's interesting that, well, let me go on before I run out of time. Here's another view of the New Bedford Barrier. That, as you know, it was a famous fishing port going back to whaling days, and over the recent decades it had declined in importance, and the economy was very stagnant. Since this barrier was opened, I think in 1953, it says there, it has become the largest fishing port, certainly on the east coast of the United States, with, in wintertime, up to 400 fishing boats moored safely behind the barrier, which the gates are normally open, but in case of a storm, would have to be closed. So to undergird all what we do at Stony Brook is good science. Right? I'm what's called a physical oceanographer. We study the physics of the ocean. We have a team of people using very modern computer models to try and model what would happen if you built sea gates, say, on the South Shore inlets. How would it affect the tidal flow? How would it cause excess buildup outside the barriers when they were closed? The answer is no, but that's a tough question we have to answer. So we want to look at water quality changes, all these environmental effects as well. And behind all this, my last slide is, what is this? This is slowly but surely rising sea level as measured in New York City at the Battery Park, since 1850 to the present. And there's a wiggly blue line, but look at that average line. That is the rise in sea level on the East Coast. It's about 1 foot every 100 years. This is not due to mankind. This is due to the results of the last ice age, when all that ice, that 2 miles of ice above us here in Islip, melted away. It caused the whole Earth system, the crust, to buckle, and it's still doing it. It's still adjusting. So that's background. The question is, what happens off to the right in the future with sea level induced by fossil fuel burning? And so there's a big uncertainty in the future, and that's my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. In furtherance of the discussion about sea gates, we have a champion here of sea gates who actually lived through firsthand the experience of Superstorm Sandy. He's the mayor of the village of Freeport. He's also the president of the New York Conference of Mayors, which keeps him running around the state right now, as well as he's an active boater. So he has firsthand experience on a number of different marine issues. We have Bob Kennedy. Bob? A little background on here. Here we go.
Yeah, that's good.
Is that good?
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Robert Kennedy. I'm the mayor of the village of Freeport. I happen to be an avid fisherman and a boater out on the South Shore of Long Island, and I have a mechanical engineering background with the United States Navy. During Superstorm Sandy, the village of Freeport had 3,500 homes under 4 feet, minimum 4 feet of salt water. It's probably the first time that New York State or or the Northeast had to deal with how do you safely de-energize everybody and put their power back on without having houses go on fire. We really come up with a method where every house that had flooded, we actually took the meter off every house and would not put it back on until a licensed electrician came in, gave us a certified letter saying the electric had been checked, tested, and we'd go back and install a meter. Many places throughout the waterfront community didn't get electric for 3 and 4 weeks, 5 weeks after that, but we had really worked on this and safely reinstalled all the meters for everybody that was ready, probably within a week or two. The Village of Freeport has an LM6000, it's 747 jet engine that provides 50 megawatts of electric to the Northeast United States. We don't use our own electric, we provide power to the grid. As we provide power to the grid, they allow us to buy it back for a cheaper rate. During this time, though, in the Village of Freeport, we maintain all our overhead wiring, substations, transformers, disconnects. All the equipment in the electrical field is maintained by the Village of Freeport employees. All of our substations that happen in the flood area exploded, were underwater, and non-usable. So what we ended up doing to prevent this in the future, an ounce of prevention, is we eliminated all substations in the flood zone areas. We raised all our transformers from 3 kVA to 13 kVA, and we ran all new feeders overhead. So now all the transformers were increased in capacity, 20, 30 feet high, and we got rid of all the substations. So even if we have another Superstorm Sandy, we shouldn't have an electrical issue, or providing electric other than on the residences themselves. We had about 15,000 tons of personal property to be removed during Sandy. I literally had dumpsters on every block and just let people fill up the dumpsters, and we paid people to come and empty them out, put them back, empty them, because it became a safety hazard. If you're out there and everybody has couches and chairs and beds and blocking up the street, you couldn't get a fire engine down the street or a police car if you needed it. So we actually put dumpsters on every block south of Merrick Road, and probably about 50 at a time, and people would just dump their stuff in and we'd have them removed. We had hundreds of fuel oil tanks floated away. Hundreds. People's fuel oil tanks outside. There were no rules on mounting them permanently. These tanks would be full of fuel. The tide came in, lifted them up, and floated away. We had oil. I literally had people calling me up and saying, my front yard smells like oil. There was an oil tank that landed on a lady's front yard, and DEC said, put dishwashing soap on it. That's all they could do. They didn't even investigate it. That's how many complaints and problems we had with floating oil tanks as a result of Superstorm Sandy. The hydraulic pressure of the water being 8 and 10 feet high in the street really affected the infrastructure, our sewer lines, maybe 50, 60 years old. But you don't realize that 4, 5, 6 years later, I'm doing a job now, it's $5 million to replace a sewer line on Woodcliff Canal because of the pressure, hydraulic pressure, actually damaged the sewer lines. And it's showing up after years. And it slowly deteriorates it, and we end up, it's a $5 million job. Natural gas. Unfortunately, you have low-pressure natural gas. It's probably less than a pound pressure. The water built up so high in many of these areas that the hydraulic pressure of the water, which is 2.36 pounds per foot, I believe it is, would go back into the gas lines and filled up all the gas lines. So now what happened is they have to start excavating, taking out gas lines, rust and they're replacing all the pressure meters, the reduction meters in front of every home or business. And now what they're doing is they're coming back and increasing it to a 60 pounds pressure on all your gas lines, but they got to dig up every street. It is a mess. I have 50 or 60 roads dug up. NetGrid is digging up the roads, running all new high-pressure lines. It is a mess. And I understand why they want to do it. It's safe, but they're preventing something from happening in the future where they don't have to invest in replacing equipment and replacing lines that have been contaminated with salt water. We had about $10 million damages to our DPW building. That's our Department of Public Works, located right on the water. $10 million in damages. And now what happens as a result, FEMA repaired it, which is great. They did a great job. But as a result now, we're required to maintain flood insurance. So it cost me $700,000, $800,000 a year in insurance that I didn't have before that I have to maintain just to keep the property running. So, there are hidden expenses you don't realize, although we got it replaced, there's a continuing maintenance cost financially for the village. One of the things that I said is, it's great that we can recover, but we must try to prevent this. And all the recovery in the world is great, but if you don't prevent it, you're going to continue having it. The water isn't going down, the water's going up. Whatever the reason is. I'm not going to say what it is, but I tell you, every year I bought a marina. The marina, when I bought it, the dock at high tide, there were fixed docks, at high tide was a foot under the water. I said, what idiot would have designed this bulkhead and this dock where it's a foot under the water at high tide? And then I go to find out it was a foot above water in the 50s. So now, we know the water's going up, we have to address it. We're going to have these problems on the waterfront community. In an effort to try to prevent some of these issues in the future, I've raised a bunch of streets. I've installed backflow valves. Backflow valves are from the bay that come into the catch basins in the street. Normally, rain collects in the streets, driveways, goes into a catch basin. A series of catch basins go into an outfall. The outfall goes into the bay. What they've done is they've installed check valves to prevent the bay from coming back in, because as the tide rises outside, the streets are lower than some of these tides at an astronomical tide. The water comes in and floods the streets. Well, when you flood the street, I can't get a police down there. I can't get a fire engine down there. It becomes a health and hazard issue. What we've done is we put check valves in, but even with the check valves in, it prevents the water from coming back in. When it rains out, and you have these check valves in, and it's a high tide, the rainwater collects in the street and stays just high as if the salt water had come in. So now what we would do is we go back and redesign everything, and I have pumps installed in every one of these catch basins. But you can't just put a pump in the existing catch basins. I got to replace all the catch basins because they're too small. You can't have the pumps cycle on and cycle off before you know it, you burn out the pumps. So all these catch basins I had to enlarge to about 10 foot by 10 foot, put in pumps, put in the check valve on a new outlet, and put a bypass on the pumps so they can bypass the check valve. In the event now it rains and you have a high tide, the pumps pump the water around the check valve back into the bay, and the streets are staying dry. There's another unmandated, unfunded mandate that the village has to take care of. Nobody's given us grants on these. It just cost me $2 million to do one area of 2 blocks. It's working fine, but all bets are off when you get an astronomical high tide and the water comes over the dock. What I've done is, in some areas now, some of the residents or businesses have defective bulkheads. So you go put in $2 million worth of pumps and backflow valves, and the one bulkhead that's defective floods at an astronomical high tide, goes into the first catch basin, and comes up in every other one and floods the whole area again. So what I've done is we've reviewed the laws in the village. We go in now and we give them 72 hours to apply for a permit. If you don't get an Army Corps application into us within, let's say, 14 days or 18 days, we have the right to go do it ourselves. I'll put the bulkhead in. It'll cost me $500,000 or $600,000. I put it on their taxes. I sell the tax lien at the end of the year. I get my money back. I don't care what happens. But we have to have safety for the people. I can't spend millions of dollars. Spend $2 million on 2 fire trucks because one guy doesn't want to fix his bulkhead. It's not going to happen. So we're going about it legally. We're replacing the bulkheads. I just bonded $2 million, and I'll get it back at the end of the year when I put a tax lien on the property. We've actually provided a temporary undercarriage freshwater washdown system for the residents that do get their car submerged in salt water. They're driving through it in some areas, salt water's coming in, real high tide during these astronomical areas. They can go by hose 3, and the guy sits out there, hits a button when they put through, fresh water washes the whole bottom of the car, they drive through when they go to work, and they are so happy. Because at least you're not getting that salt water contamination to stay on the brakes and the lining. So this is something that we're going to have fully done automatically in the future. A car comes through, it hits a light, the light turns on pump, they pull out, it shuts off, and that's that. But it's been very successful, and the people love it. Back in November of 2014, I asked for a roundtable to discuss a method of resolving this and preventing it. And I got the Army Corps, DEC, FEMA, Congress, I got New York State, Nassau County, Town of Hempstead, and a bunch of the local villages. We all got together in Freeport to demand that the feasibility study be entered into to install surge barrier gates. I brought everybody up to New Bedford, which we've seen some pictures of. New Bedford put these gates in 48 years ago. They spent $18 million on this one system. They have never flooded since they put it in. There is no residual flooding around the outside when they close the gates. They close the gates 2 hours before high tide. They open up 2 hours after a high tide. They've never flooded since in 48 years. $18 million. Okay, so there's listen, I'm shooting from the hip. I got numbers about $125 million to do it again now. But if you were to put, and we were discussing that Fire Island Inlet is one of the biggest. Well, I kind of disagree. I think Freeport has Jones Inlet, which is the biggest. But listen, the bottom line is the water is coming in the inlets and it's flooding back from the bayside onto all these barrier islands. There is proof that these surge barriers work. We got $3 million immediately to start this feasibility study. New York Army Corps of Engineers took it over. I've been working with Nassau County and DEC. They just transferred it from New York to Philadelphia. I don't know why you would transfer it from the New York branch Army Corps to the Philadelphia branch of Army Corps, but they did it. Not only did they transfer it to Philadelphia, but they asked for $6 million more. I had Philadelphia on the phone the other day. I said, listen to me, that's $9 million. You could have had 100 people at $90,000 a year or given this out to an individual private contractor to look at this. How could it be? And they still don't know if that's all it's going to cost. This is for the Nassau County Back Bay study. So, the continued pounding on the drums and calling and following up is important with this. Please, you have to call your senators and your elected officials and tell them you have to try to expedite this as soon as possible. If Sandy, another storm like Sandy hits, you don't realize, I have 300, 400 homes still vacant out of Superstorm Sandy, but these people are not going to come back the next time. They're not. The insurance rates have skyrocketed. The values of the homes have decreased. People don't want to invest in the industrial area because of the damages that they incurred in Superstorm Sandy. What's going to happen when you have another Sandy? We raised 1% of the homes on the South Shore with New York Rising. They spent $300 million. Listen, I would have put the $300 million into the gates and gotten it done already, but neither here nor there. So you raise the house on the block. You got one house raised, you got 10 low houses next to it. You have another Superstorm Sandy, you're going to have 10 zombie homes here, 10 zombie homes there. The one person who had his house raised, you think they're going to stay? They're going to be out of there as quick as, look at the rodents, the rats, the bugs, the grass. On top of that, what do you do with running a village? You can't cut your CSEA members back. You can't cut your police officers back. You're going to have 1/3 of the village that's not living there anymore. The other 2/3 of the village, you're going to have to pay the taxes for the people who aren't here. This is going to be a rippling effect that Long Island has never seen before. It's going to hurt everybody. The middle of Long Island, the North Shore of Long Island, it's going to be devastating if we get another Superstorm Sandy. It was a 100-year storm. If that year started 3 years ago, we could get another one tomorrow. We need to prevent this from happening. There's no reason why we aren't moving for these surge barrier gates very soon. Jones Inlet and East Rockaway Inlet, if you put 2 gates there, you could protect all of Nassau County. Coincidentally, I worked with the Army Corps. Well, the water from the Great South Bay could come back in and flood Nassau County. Well, I took it upon myself to buy a GPS tracker, go drop it off the Captree Bridge, and watch how long it took the tide to bring it and how far it went during high tide back. It's 3.1 miles an hour. That's what it is. The tide from Fire Island Inlet would never get into Freeport because the tide would be going out already after slack tide of 1 hour. So I don't understand what takes them so long to understand what the issues are here. We really need to move on this forward soon. Again, it's not a Republican or a Democratic issue. Everybody has to get involved with this. $9 million is the needed money now to complete it. Let's get a model built, test it, and find out if it can be done and done quickly. This is very simple. It's not like something that hasn't been done. They have them in New Orleans. They have them in Europe. They have them in Holland. They have them in New Bedford. They have Stamford, Connecticut. They're here. Let's get the test moving and protect Nassau County. Otherwise, we're going to have a problem in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And one thing I'll just mention here. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. Just want to just show you this. Hold on 1 second. As Bob pointed out here, and in fact, those that live on the South Shore know that the mainland actually did not flood from the overtopping of Jones Beach or Long Beach. It actually flooded by the water coming through the inlets. I use the analogy that the barrier islands are really literally like the dike. Unfortunately, we have half a dozen holes in the dike. They're called the inlets. And until we do something with the inlets, you can build all the dunes you want. And the Corps is in the process of building a dune structure along a lot of the barrier islands. Unfortunately, not all the barrier islands. In fact, it stops at the western boundary of Long Beach because of some parochial issues affecting the beach clubs, Atlantic Beach, etc. So what would happen is if you had the flooding, the water is just going to come and wrap around the dunes. And so as Bob's alluded to, whether it's Jones Inlet or East Rockaway Inlet, as you call it, Deb's Inlet, if we use the barrier islands as barriers, and you have an effective dune structure here, then you close off the holes in the dike, as Bob's alluded to, the inlets with surge barriers, surge gates. Then you literally could protect the south shore of Long Island. We're in better position. I mean, I thought the governor missed an opportunity here, where with the salt tax, everybody's flying to in low tax states. Everybody's going to Florida. Florida can't protect itself like Long Island can. We could actually protect ourselves even more effectively than the city. Malcolm showed you how we could protect the estuary, et cetera, as well as Long Island Sound. But Long Island is actually geophysically, I guess, and geologically structured, so we could have a barrier along the South Shore, but we need to close off those inlets. And that's really what Malcolm and Bob have been advocating for a long time now. So hopefully we're going to be able to move it forward. Our next speaker is, we have Dave Calone. Dave is not just a financial guy from Jove Equities, but he's a former chair of the Suffolk County Planning Commission, and he also headed up the Superstorm Sandy Task Force for Suffolk County. So Dave is going to report on the results of their study.
Thank you.
Dave Calone, thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, John. Appreciate the introduction. As I start, I want to call your attention to a document that was downstairs on the registration table. I know the purpose of this gathering here today is talk about a comprehensive plan for Long Island, and we created a Suffolk County comprehensive master plan in 2015, and was put together by the Suffolk County Planning Commission and the administration. And just there are copies down on the registration table. Just to give you a little flavor of the kinds of things when we talk about a regional master plan, and of course the Long Island Regional Planning Council also has their 2035 plan. So there have been a number of efforts to look more broadly at sort of what we need to do as a region, not just with resiliency, but all across. And just to give you a flavor of what kinds of things we worked on with this plan, which, as I said, was put out about 4 years ago now. The keys we felt like to building our region were creating a 21st century transit network, providing more transportation options, mobility, access, safety. 2, housing, equitable housing, affordable housing, fair housing. 3, economic competitiveness. How do we build a capacity to make Long Island more of an innovation-based economy? 4, how do we support vibrant communities? How do we make sure that those communities that are falling behind are lifted up and we make use of all the resources from every corner of our island? 5, streamlining government, coordinating our policies, leveraging investment. How do we make sure that if we have the government we need, but not too much government? And in many places, I think we would all agree that there are too many layers of government. So another issue that we tackled with this report. And the last aspect was the protecting our environment, enhancing our human capital. How do we make sure we take advantage of the God-given abilities of all of our people, while also protecting Mother Nature? And a lot of things in here relate to resiliency. And actually, my successor as chair of the Planning Commission, Jennifer Casey, is here, and she'll talk a little bit more about some of the things we talked about in this master plan as it relates to resiliency. I also want to particularly thank our chief planner for Suffolk County, who's here, Andy Freeling. Andy, thank you for everything you do for Suffolk County, and who played a huge role in the preparation of our master plan. So thank you, Andy. As John mentioned, I chaired for the last year, a little more than a year now, the Superstorm Sandy Review Task Force for Suffolk County. Was privileged to work with a number of folks on that. John was very helpful in helping us think about the issues impacting Suffolk County as it relates to Superstorm. Members of the commission are here, both Jennifer Casey as well as Dr. Malcolm, and we are thankful to Dr. Bowman for all his help as well with thinking about some of these issues that have been talked about earlier, as well as a number of issues that we tackled. So the Superstorm Sandy Task Force was put together at the recommendation of Presiding Officer of Suffolk County Legislature, Dwayne Gregory, and the resolution was adopted by the county legislature to put this task force together. We brought together people with all different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of skill sets, people with academic backgrounds, people who are on the ground responding to Sandy in their communities, community advocates, experts in various different aspects, not-for-profit leaders, government leaders. We had State Senator Brooks was on it. Mayor Scordino from the village of Babylon was on our task force. Assemblywoman Kimberly Jean-Pierre. All different kinds of folks bringing their own perspective to what we can do to be better prepared in the future. As John mentioned, the important thing to think about when we think about our resiliency as a region is to remember that we haven't had the big one yet. Right? Sandy was in some ways a teaser, and it was obviously a very impactful teaser, and it was able to show us what we could face if things go really bad. But as John said, the storm actually turned. We did not have a tremendous amount of rain as a result of the storm. It was mostly a wind-based for us here on Long Island, wind-based storm, and of course the surges were really what was the biggest impact. But what happens, and this is what we thought about as a task force, how do we prepare if we're actually going to get run over? And so that way, Sandy was instructive, how we responded, what we did to improve and respond immediately after the storm, what was our resiliency capabilities, and now, most importantly, what do we need to do going forward to make sure we're in a better spot for the next disaster. The good news is there has been a lot done in the 7 years since Sandy, and we were certain to point that out in the report. I will this was the report. It just came out. It's hot off the presses. We just released it last week, so I haven't even put together a PowerPoint on this yet, so you'll have to suffer my voice and sort of hitting some of the highlights here. But I will tell you, if you want to see a copy of this, if you go to the Suffolk County Legislature website, on the top tab, along the top, they have a section called Documents and Resources. You click on that, and then within that, there's a link to recent reports. And the Sandy report is the top 1 or 2 reports in that list. So if you would like to get a fuller look at the report, that's an opportunity to do so. We focused the report on 4 key areas. 1, storm response. That immediate response, dealing with the issues, many of the ones that the mayor was talking about. And I should say, while our mandate was to look at this from a Suffolk County perspective, we obviously had recommendations that were very applicable in Nassau County and really are regional in nature. After all, the storm does not know that there's an invisible line somewhere around Route 110 that artificially divides our island. We are one body of water, one shoreline, one people, one team really when it comes to responding to these storms. And so that was something we obviously took into account. What as a region can we do, not just what can we do as Suffolk County. So we looked at particular Suffolk County storm response, debris management, electrical restoration, those kinds of issues, portable emergency generators, those kinds of things. Our second major topic that we focused on was storm recovery and reconstruction, that non-immediate response. What did we do in the days and weeks and months after the storm hit? Everything from how do we empower neighborhood groups who were so important to getting people back on their feet throughout, particularly on the South Shore. How do we make sure that materials are pre-staged? How do we make sure that contractors are held accountable? Because there were so many issues we heard. We took 4 days of public testimony, and I know my colleagues on the commission can tell you that we heard so many stories of people who were just in a tough spot. Many of them put there by contractors who just, the malfeasance of contractors was disturbing. That's not to say, obviously, there were thousands and thousands of great stories and good outcomes, but unfortunately, the ones we continue to hear about are the ones people continue to suffer. And I would say the people who continue to suffer often were people who were sort of in a bad spot to begin with. I think these storms have a particular impact on our most vulnerable populations who are not as perhaps able to respond or may not have the resources to respond as quick as some others. That's an important thing, I think, to keep in mind, particularly when we talk about resiliency, is that we need to make sure that those vulnerable communities are at least as well protected as everyone else, because they have a much harder time getting back on their feet. The third major area we looked at was storm infrastructure. So things like that the mayor talked about, our natural gas infrastructure, gasoline stations. You may all remember, I remember waiting in line for gas on the days after Sandy. What do we need to do? The state has taken some important steps to make sure we're in a better situation with that now. What more can we do? The mayor mentioned floating tanks and oil spills. We had recommendations in there for the towns and villages about how you requiring strapping down all propane tanks, all gas tanks that are in the flood zone, et cetera. So one thing that's interesting to think about from an infrastructure perspective, since we happen to have this slide up, is that so many of our critical pieces of infrastructure here, particularly in Suffolk County, and I believe it's true in Nassau County as well, are in the flood zone and in that impacted area, whether it's the hospitals. Good Samaritan Hospital had water flowing in the front door. Southside Hospital, same thing. Sewage treatment plants, the biggest one in Suffolk County, is right on the water's edge at Bergen Point. Basically handles the sewage treatment for, about a quarter of the landmass of Suffolk County. So we have pieces of infrastructure that are critically at risk, which is another reason why resiliency is so important, and I'll talk about that in another minute. We have another hospital actually in Greenport, which is off the map here, literally on a peninsula, and on the day of the storm, they became literally an island. So you had people getting impacted by the storm who couldn't get to the hospital because the hospital basically had a moat around it thanks to the storm. So all of these are things that we need to do better at, and we, no aspersions cast on any of those who came before. We just know better now, because of the experience we've all lived through, where the weaknesses are. And we need to, we put together recommendations on how we can improve that. But the last and perhaps most important piece of our report did really relate to resiliency, and how do we make sure that we are ready to bounce back. And the bottom line, of course, here is that we here on Long Island, particularly Suffolk County being at the end of the island, we're living basically on a sandbar stuck out into the ocean. We have, hundreds of miles of coastline, and we are on the front lines of climate change and the rising sea levels, perhaps more than anywhere else in the world, right here on Long Island. So what we do not only matters to us, but also can be an example for those around the country and around the world who are dealing with similar issues. When it comes to resiliency, the task force focused on a couple of things. One of those is land use and zoning policies. Obviously, how we govern our land says a tremendous amount about our values and what's important to us. And look, people move to Long Island in many ways, because they wanted to be near the water, and that's all good and well. But we now need to deal with the fact that sometimes there's consequences to that, particularly in an era of rising seas. And so the task force recommended that the Regional Planning Council and the Suffolk County Planning Commission work with the towns and villages on land use policies to discourage development to the extent that there are open spaces to develop near the water that are not currently preserved, to actually try to change those land use allowances in those areas. And importantly, and this is going to be something that's probably going to need to be talked about more and more, is are there places we need to retreat from? At the end of the day, we cannot beat Mother Nature. We can hardscape against it. There are things we can do, but there are certain places on Long Island that don't have a barrier beach in front of them. And one of those is Montauk. And Montauk, the town of East Hampton has been putting together as part of their master plan. They did a hamlet study of the hamlet of Montauk, and looking at what do they need to do to actually kind of have the development of Montauk step back. And so there are a number of ways of looking at that, a number of techniques that we describe, but that notion of retreating from the ocean is something that I think a number of areas, particularly those not protected by the barrier beaches, that's more in Suffolk County than Nassau, but we'll need to be thinking about. We can keep putting up different kinds of defenses, but eventually, if sea level rises as is expected to do by another 2 or 3 feet, there's not a lot you can do in low-lying areas. And so that's going to be something I think that planners and others need to be thinking about, leaders need to be thinking about. There are tools. This is not the only place in the country where this has been looked at, but there needs to be sort of simulations done to look at where the impacts will be of rising sea levels on low-lying areas, and then discussion with the public about what options are. And I think in Montauk, the town of East Hampton is proposing, for instance, that the motels right along the oceanward strip basically roll back by a couple of streets. And obviously, there's all sorts of issues between equity and economic investment and all sorts of things that need to be dealt with. But the bottom line is, those motels are not going to be there in a couple of decades. So how do we actually kind of retrench and prepare our communities for that reality? Another important thing is building standards, right? The towns and villages obviously have impact through the building codes and your state building code. There's the towns and villages can sometimes build on top of, but needing to look at how we're building. There were some great examples we have in the document showing how there were houses standing right next to each other, particularly on Fire Island and some on Jones Beach Island, where literally you could tell the difference in the houses were made differently, right? Because one was standing and the other was kind of tipped over and falling apart. So again, hard economic choices, but at the end of the day, it's better to build stronger first now than to actually have to repair and reconstruct later. So those are important aspects. We have a number of recommendations around that. Another critical area, and we've heard just talked a lot about, we just had a county executive race in Suffolk County where this guy talked a lot about, but it's protecting our coastal wetlands and our water quality. And the reason that matters so much, as many of you in this room know, is because our water quality and the degradation, particularly in Suffolk County with our lack of sewers and other wastewater treatment, is having a tremendous impact on our wetlands. And the wetlands, as you all know, are that first buffer of against storms. We have wetlands, we have protection. The fact that, and we have some diagrams in here that show how the wetlands, particularly our bays in the Great South Bay, et cetera, the wetlands have decreased tremendously over the last 30 years, largely driven by water quality issues that we have in the Great South Bay. So, I mean, the county, in Suffolk County, has been working on this issue, and I think one of the critical things that we're going to need to figure out in Suffolk County in particular is how do you pay for that, right? I mean, there's going to need to be a long-term solution about how we pay for water quality here, in Suffolk County when we don't have sewers, and we don't necessarily want to or should have sewers everywhere. But how do you pay for that denitrification? How do you pay to reduce the nitrogen going into our surface waters that are in turn impacting our wetlands and causing our wetlands to shrink, which are in turn making our towns and villages and all our residents much more vulnerable because they don't have that buffer from the water. There are a number of interesting things we point out in the report that about something called living shorelines. It's been done in other places. It's a method of resiliency that sort of acknowledges that we have real people living in these communities and they need to continue living in those communities, but how do we create buffers? And one of the ideas is a living shoreline. And the best example of that I can point you to, for those of you who know the village of Patchogue, is Shorefront Park. So Shorefront Park is an existing park right on the waterfront in the village of Patchogue, just south of downtown. And what they've done is, as part of the buyout process where New York State, New York Rising bought some of the houses right around that park that got all flooded out, and of course the park got flooded out. But they've tacked those spaces onto the park, and now they're building along the front of the park different kinds of storm calming measures. And so you have, with Shorefront Park, they've put it to use not only, of course, as a park that people can enjoy, it's a beautiful scenery and setting, and there's ball fields and all that, but you have a buffer that's been built to protect the houses that are behind and the whole village that's behind Shorefront Park. So for those who are looking for examples of what we can do to not only, obviously protect against storms, but also meld that protection into like an amenity that people are going to be excited about, that's a great example. There's been other things done in Babylon Village and some other places as well that are worth looking at. But that realization that we need to protect, but putting that in context with the fact that people need to live their lives, and we want people, of course, to enjoy living close to the water, which is one of the great things that makes Long Island so special, is critically important. Another major recommendation that we had that's worth pointing out is certainly relating to our barrier beaches. As John said, we're unlike Florida and unlike many places, we actually are lucky because we have Mother Nature has built in a protection for us. And one of the questions for us is how do we best put that to use? As Malcolm showed the slide, but I may not have really maybe captured, or I just want to reflect on that, the slide that showed how much, when he pointed it out, how much the sand has moved. I mean, we are on an island, literally our sands are moving constantly, One of the best examples of that is the fact, and I think Malcolm pointed this out, but I'll just point it out again, that the Fire Island Lighthouse is actually east of the Robert Moses Causeway, and is right about here. And the reason for that is because that was the tip when it was built. And now we have 5 miles, which is a tremendous thing when you think about it. We've had 5 more miles of sand that's pushed along these beaches, and now have caused this whole hook to the west. Now, as you know, if you go over there, you have couple miles of walking trails and beach to the west once you get over the Captree and the Fire Island Bridge there. But you know, this is a reality. Again, we can't stop it. How do we learn to live with it? How do we learn to harness it? And both John and Malcolm and the mayor mentioned that other places are dealing with this, whether it's the storm gates. One thing that we were looking at in particular is in the Netherlands, they have something called a sand engine. And they put the sand engine into place, knowing, of course, and modeling scientifically using computers, et cetera, where sand goes. They've put sand, they've dug up sand from out in the ocean, dumped it on the barrier, made a wide barrier beach, knowing that over the next 20, 30 years, that sand would then drift and actually add to the beaches in front of their most vulnerable areas. They did this I think it was about 20 years ago, and now literally you can see the beaches are far wider where they knew that sand would drift to, and they protected some low-lying villages in that way. Well, you know, why shouldn't we look at doing that as well? There's no reason. It's certainly expensive, but it's less expensive than constantly what the Army Corps does now, which is spend millions of dollars each year dumping new sand, and then it gets washed away, and then they dump new sand, and it gets washed away, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the village of Montauk, they spend, I think, about $3 million putting in the hamlet of Montauk, $3 million on sandbags that got washed out, I believe, in about 9 months. And this is going to happen over and over and over and over again. So why don't we come up with something different? What they did in the Netherlands with the sand engine is what the sand engine does is it scoops up water from out beyond, and you can look at the floor of the ocean, et cetera, and figure out how far you have to go out so you're not impacting the waterfront. Scoop up the sand, and they basically shoot it back onto the barrier beaches. We could actually do this as an inter-county thing. Both Nassau and Suffolk could work together on this because we both have the same problem, and look at you know, funding something like that jointly. The amount of money that you save over time with the Army Corps of Engineers just plopping down you know, geotiles full of sand is tremendous over time. So it's absolutely worth looking at, and we feel strongly that is something that could be a good solution for us. The barriers that everyone here previously has talked about, the mayor and Malcolm and John, clearly, again, we looked at other places. We saw the other places in the United States. We saw what Malcolm showed up about the Thames River. Again, the Netherlands has the same thing. These are places where they've been dealing with this same sort of issue for an extended period of time. They are working in other places. We need to study it for a number of reasons. One, will it be effective? But two, there are issues with regard to sedimentology, with regard to the aquaculture, with regard to the economics in terms of our economy, et cetera, fishing, et cetera. But the bottom line is, and it's important to remember, these barriers aren't closed 99% of the time. So 99% of the time they're open and the water's flowing back and forth just like it always does naturally. It's at that time of biggest peril, a couple hours before a storm to a couple hours after a storm, where you can close them. And you spend maybe $100 million doing this, but you think of that impact. The mayor, I think, spoke eloquently about this. Think about that impact, that savings for those just a couple of hours. And it's just a couple of hours. One of the striking things is that when you look at the timeline of Sandy, that tide was only in it washed in, did all its damage, and it washed out. And it was just for that. If we had, for 6 hours, if we had lower tide, or if we had barriers, we would be, a much, much different situation than we're in today. The mayor, of course, talked about, the two inlets in Nassau County. In Suffolk, we actually have, there's 6 of them, I believe, that go all the way to Shinnecock. So there's a number of inlets. Of course, all the bays are generally connected. So for Suffolk County in particular, there'd be a need to look at where it makes sense to install a number of those. But I think that's certainly, I know the commission, the task force felt strongly that's an important aspect. 2 more recommendations I'll share with you. One, offshore reefs. So other places are doing this, and it was interesting, offshore reefs as a way, artificial reefs as a way to cut down on storm surge coming in. We've done, the governor's used parts of the Tappan Zee Bridge and dumped it off on Long Island Sound to improve fisheries and shellfish and all that, which is a great idea generally. But other places have used actually putting down offshore reefs, artificial offshore reefs, to help us breakwaters. And if you do it the right way, obviously there's navigational issues you need to take into account, et cetera. But so much of that surge can be cut down, and has done in other places, cut down with some offshore reefs. Lastly, and perhaps in some ways most importantly, the task force recommended the creation of a coastal commission. Because there's a lot of information here, there's a lot of detail, and a lot of this relates to land use, which of course in our state is a town and village oriented power. A coastal commission could do a number of things, particularly help advise our towns and villages on land use policies as it relates to being near the water. It could use recommend best practices for things like offshore reefs and work on issues like the storm gates, et cetera. The Regional Plan Association, which put together their plan for our tri-state region last year, recommended the creation of a New York, New Jersey, Connecticut tri-state regional coastal commission, they called it. We talked with them and said, if you're not getting any traction on that, would it make sense for our counties, Nassau and Suffolk, to work together to just create a Long Island Coastal Commission to start working on these issues? And they thought that would be a tremendous first step and show how a coastal commission, while not taking power away from the towns and villages, could help empower them with information and how to create land use policies, et cetera. So I'm sure we'll have a little time for questions afterwards, and and Jennifer, I'm sure will fill in everything I missed, but John, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dave. Excellent, Dave. Thank you very much. Okay. Our last speaker today is Jennifer Casey. She's a partner with the law firm of Amity Demers and McManus, and she's the chair of the Suffolk County Planning Commission. So to continue the discussion about Suffolk County, and Jennifer, welcome. Good to have you here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I think Dave said everything I need to say, but I'll try to fill in a little bit. That's okay. I want to thank Dave, though. He did a great job, along with Dorian and all the other members, of working on this task force. I mean, it was a monumental effort. I have to say, when I began on the task force, I didn't know as much as I know now, and it's pretty scary. I have to say, one of the most interesting things that I learned, and people here, I might have told this, and people that were at this hearing might have heard this, there was a restaurateur from Oakdale who talked about this example about if you had a piece of felt and you put it on the table, if you spilt a glass of water, the felt would absorb all the water that you spilt. It wouldn't go on your lap. But if that felt wasn't there, all that water would go on your lap. And that was this example about how the seagrasses and all that stuff works on the shores of Long Island. And that really, for me, I mean, I don't know if it works for you guys, but that really worked for me, showing me how important it is to have that softscape and along the shores, to absorb all that energy and force that's hitting Long Island every day, and how important it is. And one of the things that Dave brought up, which is, I think, very important, is what they've done in Patchogue with some of these abandoned properties, is helping build that park. And I think one of the challenges after Superstorm Sandy was the response. And it was very overwhelming. Most government entities and other people hadn't dealt with this before. So, they were trying to figure out what to do. And looking back on it now, we see what they did wrong, but they did a lot of really great things. And that's an important thing to remember, especially if any of you get a chance to read this report, that some people did amazing things came out of this and will make us more prepared in the future. But one of the challenges that did occur was the hodgepodge response to housing. Some houses were knocked down and nothing ever went up there again. Some people rebuilt their houses in kind. So say the house was on a slab on the ground without a base, they just built it the exact same way. And some people lifted their houses. I know a family who initially rebuilt their house in kind, and then 2 or 3 years later, now they've lifted it up. And it's crazy. I mean, all that money being spent, whether or not it's their money or someone else's money or the state's money, it's just resources being spent in ways that it shouldn't be spent. I think it's smarter to know going forward, maybe not rebuild if it floods. And one of our other members said something offhand. He's retiring from his post, so he's like, I can tell you this now. but don't build where it floods. I mean, it's the simplest thing, because if it floods now, it's going to always flood. And we see that now even without storms, which is really a challenge. I met a woman recently who lives out in the Hamptons, and she's a real estate broker, and we had that massive flooding 2 weeks ago, I think it was. People were stranded in a restaurant out in Bay Shore that they had to come get them in boats, and there wasn't even a storm, and we had flooding. And she said, you know what, we couldn't show houses that day out on Dune Road because of the flooding. You know, and they have to change their model of business because of the flooding, because they don't want potential home buyers to see the flooding. As chair of the Planning Commission, I've learned a lot about how diverse Suffolk County is. And I think it's, you know, Nassau County is very diverse, but Suffolk County is so different. We have areas just by the Nassau border, just like Nassau County. But then, you know, our Planning Commission yesterday, and Andy came with us, we went out to Shelter Island, and we had an amazing day. And I learned a lot, and how important water has been to the history of Long Island. We visited the Sylvester Manor, which has been a homestead there for over 360 years. And before that, Native Americans lived there, and they realized the resources that were there. They've done archaeological digs there and found clam bakes that's been going on for, you know, thousands of years, and it's fascinating. But they were telling us about how much acreage they have, and the acreage has decreased because of rising tides. We also learned about problems on Shelter Island, that they have saltwater infiltration in their water, their drinking water. My daughter went out to a camp out of Quinnipiac, and at the beginning of September, you can't drink the water there because there's so much infiltration. So that's a real problem. I don't have that problem in Huntington, but the fact that people in Suffolk, in other places in Suffolk County have that problem is a real concern for me. And there's just so much history, and I think it's so important for us as residents of this county to know more about, and of Nassau, to know where we came from in order to go forward. I think that helps us a lot with our planning and what we should do going forward. I think, you know, the thought about not building going forward is really important. And also, other areas of the country, planning commissions look at flood zones, and those projects are brought to their attention right away. So that's one of the things we're going to look at as what the criteria is for applications being referred to us. If the place that they're being built is in a flood zone, it's going to come to us right away. And we'll determine maybe there's other things that we need to look at, because the towns and villages have a different perspective than the county does, because the towns and villages have a real economic impetus that they want to build, so they have that tax roll, and it makes more money for them to have a house or a commercial business there than to have a passive park. But on a county level, we can see that maybe it should be a park, maybe it needs to be passive for the future. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. You know, the retreat study that Dave talked about is really important, that East Hampton did, with how Montauk has to look at their commercial properties and where they're going to be going forward. We're seeing that with some of the properties that are coming to us, projects that are coming to us now. What I find very interesting is that a lot of our new projects are out east, because that is where there's still some open property. And I think the demographics have changed with technology, that a lot more people that used to just spend their summers out east are now there year-round, because it's such a great place to be. Why go back someplace else if you can stay here year-round? So because of that, there's more of a need for doctors' offices, there's a more need for grocery stores, all those things that we need every day, you need for people year-round, and that also implicates transportation, and there's so many other challenges with that. But out east is so much more vulnerable. The land is much narrower. There's much more infiltration of water. So it's an important place to look at for us going forward as to what should be built there and what shouldn't be built there. Dave was also speaking about the barrier reefs, and there's a really interesting podcast, if anyone's interested. I listened to it. It was great. It's all about this $1 million, I think it's called the Million Oyster Project, that was started to help with Staten Island, and all. They had such devastation there. But it's based on Governor's Island, and they have this whole educational program and helping to teach school children in New York City about oysters and how important they are to build the reefs. And that's something I think education is also one of the most important things for us going forward. Not the school children, it's very important, but one of our members of my group, Scott Carlin, who is a professor at LIU, was very concerned about the 100 years going forward. And as scientists, looking forward to see what needs to be done, not for today, not for tomorrow, but for the future generations, and how important it is for everyone to become more self-reliant and communities to be more self-reliant. You cannot rely on the government to take care of you in a time of a natural disaster. You really need to be able to take care of yourself and be able to take care of your community. And that goes down to growing your own food or having local food sources and and doing things that you can be more self-reliant. And I think that's a really important message. And I think our young people are learning that because they see what's going on and they know that this place is going to be a lot different when they're older than it is right now, and they need to be prepared for that. So I think that's an important thing. And we talked, I think in the report also, was having these local areas for communication, because that was a real problem for people after the storm. People didn't know what was going on. I know living in Huntington, I was affected a lot differently than people on the South Shore, where I didn't have water pouring into my house, but I had no electricity. I had trees down. I couldn't drive anywhere. I had a 5-year-old daughter. It was really cold out, and it was Halloween, and she wanted to go trick-or-treating, and you couldn't go trick-or-treating. And how do you explain that to a 5-year-old? And you go into grocery stores, there was no lights. And I think the biggest challenge for the North Shore was that there was no gasoline. You couldn't get any gas for your car, so you didn't want to drive anywhere because you were afraid you were going to get stranded. And then you had lines. So I think from that we've learned that we have to have generators for the gas stations so they can give gas to cars. You know, there's a lot of things that I learned personally, and I'm hoping that the Planning Commission can make recommendations going forward, such as we talked about oil tanks coming off of buildings. You know, it's on a local level to have that, but maybe what we are trying to do is draft model codes that can be implemented by towns and villages, because not all towns and villages have the resources to draft codes. So under Andy Freeling, who great planning department that Suffolk County has, we're able to draft codes to put out there for people, and we're doing stuff now with parking stall reduction, which is a great thing for transit-oriented development and decreasing those issues with vehicles, and doing stuff with inclusive housing to help populations that need to have housing in Suffolk County. So we have that ability to do things to help all of Suffolk County. And I think the most important thing that I can tell you from what I've learned from my experience is not to build where it floods, and to be really important. It's really important to think before you build. I mean, building's really important. I'm not a developer. I'm an attorney. I do personal injury defense, so that's not my world. But I think that we have such a fragile ecosystem that we really need to be more to think more before we build, because people want to build because of economic reasons, but if we build in the wrong places and these storms come along, it's going to cause more problems going forward. So I think it's just important for us to do that. Thank you.
So that pretty much closes the program here. I think there's a couple of things to reflect on, a number of things to reflect on, and I think all our speakers have alluded to it. But if you recall that there are literally were tens of billions of dollars spent and allocated for the New York and New Jersey area, most of that money was really spent for recovery. And for future prevention, not that much was spent. And if you look at really the allocation, a lot of it was really spent on somewhat a parochial basis, on localized basis, and not really a regional basis. What we've been talking about here is trying to deal with the inevitability of Sandy 2. And Sandy 2, as we've discussed, could be a lot worse than Sandy 1. We're not that much more protected than we were before. There's been some good money spent on, I think, on critical infrastructure, but with regard to the communities themselves, not that much. We have time for about maybe 1 or 2 questions of any of the panelists. Neil.
Yeah, hi. Neil with the Sustainability Institute of Malloy, and this is the land use program. I'll mention I'm also a Nassau County Planning Commission member. So when it comes to climate change, the actions, the policy debates sort of fit into 2 categories, either mitigation or adaptation. And today we talked a little bit about adaptation. I think the points that the mayor made and really the panel made overall about the need for the surge gates is really powerful. However, do you have a concern that if you embrace an adaptation solution that's very expensive, that it kind of undermines the efforts to get change in terms of mitigation, which is, you know, converting energy to solar and wind and making buildings more efficient and all that? Do you see it as sort of a either or, and is that part of what you're running into in terms of the hesitations? You know, the study hasn't moved forward after all these years. There is evidence other places that it works. You know, is that related to the pushback? And the other quick question is, since we have a couple of Suffolk folks, would you guys support the idea if we phased in the gates, where the first 2 gates were put in East Rockaway and Jones Beach, as the mayor suggested, would actually produce some pretty significant improvements but might not be seen as beneficial to Suffolk as much.
Well, in reference to wind power and solar power, I think that could be done in conjunction with a program such as this. And it depends on the specific area. You know, if you look at a place like Freeport, for example, which has a ability to produce electric at a reduced rate, in some cases it doesn't even pay to have solar anymore. We installed solar panels and it didn't pay the cost to install them and replace them after 7 years, you know, state-of-the-art equipment that for the rate that we're paying for a kilowatt of electric, it just didn't pay. But I am 100% towards wind power, additional solar power, and contributing it to a grid. You know, in the village, you also have to consider, in the event of an emergency, as it was brought up by several of our panelists, where do you get the electric to provide power to the gas stations, to the banks, to the Office of Emergency Management, to the police departments? And these are areas that you could store that power by having some windmills and solar power. Put that in conjunction with protecting the waterfront community. It's a big community, the waterfront community. And I think that, keeping the residents and keeping the businesses, you can really then continue to develop some of these scientific methods of storing electric and saving energy.
Malcolm?
We have to understand there are actually two types of problems which are connected but distinct. The first is slowly but rising sea level, which we can expect to accelerate in the decades ahead. Then you have the brief, intense, extreme weather events, not only hurricanes, but winter nor'easters. And then the next thing I think, I always ask people, what is the time horizon that you're talking about? Because if you're talking about what can we do in the next 10 years or 15 years, it's one thing, right? Soft solutions. My group looks at 100 years, or even 100, we dare look at 150 years into the future. Beyond that, that's God's territory, you know. So what can we do? So it just depends on the time frame and which kind of meteorological event or rising sea level you're talking about. So, you know, part of my job is to sort of try and bridge that philosophical divide between what you might call the green and the gray being the engineering and the green being the... And there's a lot of talking past each other. But if we can find a rational framework and understand, you know, time horizons and the type of thing we're trying to protect against, it makes a lot more sense. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's not either or really. And for New York City, what we're proposing is what we call a layered defense, that there needs to be offshore storm surge barriers as far away from highly developed areas as possible, like Sandy Hook, Rockaway, and the Upper East River. And their job is just to stop the Sandy-type extreme events. They will not help with the rising sea level problem, but if you can keep the city safe for the next decades and then build lower walls just to protect against rising sea level, we can plan for retreat if necessary, or what we can do to mitigate. But eventually, you know, this climate change, the storm surge, is not going to change, you know, in the decades ahead, no matter how much we try. So we have to keep both the short term and the long term, and maybe that helps.
Thank you, Malcolm. I think we need to close so we can prepare for the next session. But if we will, we're going to continue this dialogue. Let's educate the electorate. Let's educate our elected officials so that the priorities are put in the right direction. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Thank you.